exists a crime that has remained unpunished for thousands of years, a crime so ancient that it has become the template for every murder that followed. But the story you were told about Cain and Abel is a lie. Or more precisely, it is a half-truth carefully designed to hide the identity of the real guilty party. Because the first murder in human history was not simply the result of a jealous brother's envy. It was the direct, inevitable, and tragic consequence of an injustice committed by God himself. An unexplainable, cruel, and arbitrary favoritism that turned two brothers into mortal enemies. We have been taught that Cain was the villain, that Abel was the innocent victim, that God was the righteous judge who punished the wicked. But what if I told you that this comfortable narrative is protecting the true architect of the tragedy? What if the blood on that ancient field points not just to Cain's hands, but to the divine throne itself? Today, we are going to expose what the biblical text reveals when we stop reading it with the eyes of blind faith and start examining it with the unforgiving light of reason. This is not going to be a comfortable journey. We are about to pull back the curtain on one of the most sacred stories in human history and reveal the uncomfortable truth that has been hiding in plain sight for millennia. We are going to show you how God's inexplicable preference for one brother over another created the perfect conditions for humanity's first act of violence. Think about it for a moment. How many times have you heard the story of Cain and Abel? How many sermons have explained it as a simple tale of good versus evil, of righteousness versus sin, of obedience versus rebellion? But here is the question that nobody wants to ask, the question that makes religious authorities deeply uncomfortable. If Cain was so evil and Abel was so righteous, why does the biblical text itself not provide even a single reason for God's preference? Why does the story begin with an act of divine favoritism that has absolutely no explanation, no justification, no moral foundation whatsoever? Baptism, redemption, and blood. This absence of explanation is not a minor detail that we can brush aside. It is the beating heart of the entire tragedy. It is the foundational crack in the edifice of biblical morality. Because if God can reject someone without any apparent reason, if he can show arbitrary favoritism between his own creations, then we are not dealing with a just judge. We are dealing with a capricious and tyrannical father. And the consequences of having such a father are not merely theological or philosophical. They are violent, bloody, and absolutely predictable. For thousands of years, we have accepted the narrative that religious institutions have fed us. We have been told to have faith, to not question, to accept that God's ways are higher than our ways. But what if this acceptance of the unexplainable is exactly what keeps us trapped in cycles of injustice? What if the story of Cain and Abel, when examined honestly, reveals not the justice of God, but the danger of blind obedience to arbitrary authority? The philosopher Baruch Spinoza understood this danger. He lived in an age when questioning religious narratives could cost you everything. He was excommunicated from his own community, threatened, attacked, and marginalized for daring to apply reason to sacred texts. But he did it anyway, because he knew that humanity's freedom depended on our willingness to examine even the most sacred stories with honest, critical eyes. And when Spinoza examined the biblical text, he did not see infallible divine revelation. He saw human authors projecting their own fears, their own prejudices, and their own experiences of injustice onto the cosmic level. So today we stand on Spinoza's shoulders. We are going to do what he taught us to do. We are going to read this ancient story not as believers required to accept every word as divine truth, but as free human beings, using our God-given reason to understand what this text actually says and what it reveals about the nature of justice, favoritism, and violence. We are going to ask the dangerous questions. We are going to follow the evidence wherever it leads, even if it leads to conclusions that make us uncomfortable. Welcome to an analysis that will change forever the way you understand the first chapter of human violence. Welcome to the truth about why God preferred Abel, and welcome to the realization that the first murder was not just Cain's crime, it was also God's. Before we dive deeper into this analysis that will challenge everything you thought you knew about the first murder in history, I need you to understand why this matters. This is not just an academic exercise in biblical interpretation. This is not just about an ancient story that happened thousands of years ago. The way we read this story has real consequences for how we understand justice, authority, and power in our world today. When we accept the traditional narrative of Cain and Abel without question, we are accepting something far more dangerous than a simple Bible story. We are accepting the idea that authority figures do not need to explain themselves. We are accepting that some people can be favored and others rejected without any reason. We are accepting that when someone reacts with anger to unfair treatment, they are the problem, not the system that treated them unfairly. We are teaching ourselves and our children to submit to arbitrary power without questioning it. Think about the implications of this for a moment. If God can show favoritism without explaining why, and we are supposed to accept it as righteous and just, then what stops human authorities from doing the same thing? Kings, presidents, employers, parents, teachers. If divine authority does not need to justify itself, then human authority can claim the same privilege. This is how tyranny is born. This is how injustice becomes normalized. This is how we end up with systems where some people are treated better than others for no reason that anyone can explain, and we are all supposed to just accept it as the way things are. For centuries, this story has been used to teach obedience. It has been used to tell people that when bad things happen to them, they should look inward and ask what they did wrong, even when they did nothing wrong at all. It has been used to protect those in power from accountability by suggesting that authority comes from God and questioning it is sinful. This is not just theology. This is a tool of control, and it has kept humanity trapped in patterns of injustice for thousands of years. But it does not have to be this way. We can read this story differently. We can use our reason to examine it honestly. We can ask the questions that we have been taught not to ask, and in doing so, we can free ourselves from narratives that no longer serve us. We can build a better understanding of morality, one that is based not on submission to arbitrary authority, but on principles of justice and fairness that we can actually understand and defend. This is why each like on this video matters. Every time you engage with content like this, you are pushing back against centuries of intellectual control. Every subscription is a statement that you value truth over comfortable lies. Every comment where you share your thoughts is part of a larger conversation about how we free ourselves from outdated narratives. And if this channel helps you in your journey toward clearer thinking, consider becoming a member or supporting this work. Because challenging sacred narratives has always been dangerous. It requires a community of people who are willing to think for themselves and support others who do the same. Now, let us return to the scene of the crime. Let us go back to that field where Abel fell. But this time, we are not going to start with the murder itself. We are going to start with the moment when the seed of violence was planted. The moment when God Himself created the perfect conditions for tragedy. We are going to examine the text with the eyes of a detective, not the eyes of a believer who has already decided what the answer must be. And what we find there will shock you. Let us begin by laying out the story exactly as most people have heard it their entire lives. This is the version taught in Sunday schools, preached from pulpits, and passed down through generations as a simple moral tale about good and evil, obedience and rebellion, righteousness and sin. The story goes like this. Cain was the older brother, a farmer who worked the land. Abel was the younger brother, a shepherd who raised sheep. Both brothers decided to bring offerings to God. Cain brought some of the fruits and vegetables he had grown from his fields. Abel brought animals from his flock, specifically the firstborn of his sheep, along with their fat. God looked at both offerings and made His decision. He accepted Abel's offering with pleasure and approval. He rejected Cain's offering without explanation. Cain, consumed by jealousy and burning with rage, took his brother Abel out into the field one day and murdered him. God discovered the crime, confronted Cain, and punished him by cursing him and sending him away to wander the earth. End of story. According to the traditional interpretation, the moral is clear and simple. Cain represents evil, jealousy, and disobedience. Abel represents goodness, faith, and righteousness. God represents perfect justice, rewarding the good and punishing the wicked. Cain got what he deserved. Abel was an innocent victim. God acted with complete righteousness throughout. The lesson we are supposed to learn is that we should be like Abel, not like Cain. We should bring our best to God, have the right heart attitude, and never let jealousy control us. This is the narrative that billions of people have accepted without question. It is clean, simple, and morally straightforward. It gives us a clear villain to condemn and a clear hero to admire. It reassures us that God is just and that evil gets punished. But there is something profoundly disturbing lurking beneath this tidy narrative. Something that once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Something that shatters the entire moral framework of the story. Here is the question that nobody wants to ask, but that we must ask if we are going to be intellectually honest. Why exactly did God reject Cain's offering? What was wrong with it? What rule did Cain break? What sin had Cain committed before he brought the fruits of his labor to present them to God? Think carefully about this question, because it is the key to everything that follows. The biblical text, in a moment of brutal and perhaps unintentional honesty, offers absolutely no explanation. None whatsoever. It does not say that Cain brought rotten fruit while Abel brought perfect animals. It does not say that Cain had a bad attitude while Abel had a pure heart. It does not say that Cain was disobedient while Abel was faithful. It does not provide any moral, logical, or theological reason for the rejection. The text simply states with chilling directness that God looked with favor on Abel and his offering, but he did not look with favor on Cain and his offering. Read that again slowly. God looked with favor on Abel. God did not look with favor on Cain. No explanation, no justification, no reason given. It is pure, arbitrary favoritism presented as fact. Now, some people will immediately jump in here to defend God. They will say that Abel brought the firstborn of his flock with the fat, which shows he brought his best, while Cain just brought some fruit, which implies he did not bring his best. But this interpretation is desperate and dishonest. The text does not say that Cain failed to bring the first fruits or the best of his harvest. It simply does not specify the quality of Cain's offering in the same detailed way it describes Abel's. This is a narrative technique used by the author, not an indication that Cain's offering was somehow inferior or inadequate. Even if we were to accept that Abel's offering was somehow objectively better, that still does not answer the fundamental question. Why did God not explain this to Cain? Why did God not say, "Cain, I am rejecting your offering because you did not bring your best, and here is what you need to do differently next time"? A good father corrects his children and explains what they did wrong so they can improve. A good teacher points out mistakes and provides guidance. But God does neither of these things. He simply rejects Cain without explanation and expects Cain to somehow figure out what he did wrong. This absence of explanation is not a minor detail we can overlook. It is the heart of the entire tragedy. It is the crack in the foundation that brings down the whole building. Because if God can reject someone without giving a reason, if he can show arbitrary favoritism between his own creations, if he can treat people differently without any explanation or justification, then what we have is not a just judge. What we have is a capricious tyrant. What we have is a father who plays favorites and expects his children to accept it without complaint. And here is the thing about arbitrary favoritism. It does not just hurt feelings. It destroys relationships. It breeds resentment. It creates competition where there should be cooperation. It turns siblings into enemies. It plants seeds of violence that will inevitably grow and bear terrible fruit. This is not theology. This is basic human psychology that anyone who has ever experienced favoritism or witnessed it can understand. Imagine yourself in Cain's position for just a moment. You have worked hard. You have planted seeds in the ground. You have watered them and waited patiently for them to grow. You have protected your crops from animals and weather. You have harvested the fruits of your labor with your own hands. And then you bring these fruits as an offering to God with sincere devotion and genuine faith. You are not trying to cheat God. You are not holding back. You are giving what you have, the product of your work, the fruits of the earth that you have cultivated. And then, without warning, without explanation, without any comprehensible reason, God rejects your offering, not because it is inadequate, not because you did something wrong, not because you broke some rule that you knew about, simply because God prefers your younger brother, simply because God likes sheep better than wheat, simply because God has favorites, and you are not one of them. How would you feel? Would you not be confused, wondering what you did wrong? Would you not be hurt, feeling rejected by the one whose approval matters most? Would you not be angry, sensing the profound injustice of being treated differently than your brother, for no reason you can understand? Of course you would feel all these things. Any normal human being would, and the biblical text, in one of its rare moments of psychological honesty, admits exactly this. The text tells us that Cain was very angry and his face fell. This is not the reaction of someone who is evil by nature. This is the natural human response to being treated unfairly. Cain is not angry because he has a wicked heart that enjoys sin. He is angry because he has been humiliated publicly without cause. He has been rejected arbitrarily by the only authority figure in his universe. He has been shown in the most direct way possible that he is not favored, not chosen, not preferred, and he has no idea why. This is where the story becomes even more disturbing, because God, who created this situation of flagrant injustice, does not offer any explanation for his actions. He does not say, "Cain, let me help you understand why I made this decision." He does not provide guidance or correction. Instead, he does something that is extraordinarily cruel. He blames Cain for being angry about the injustice. Now, let us open the book of Genesis, chapter 4, and examine this text the way a detective examines evidence at a crime scene. We are not going to read it with the eyes of devoted believers who have already decided what it must mean. We are going to read it with the cold, clear eyes of investigators searching for truth, following the evidence wherever it leads, no matter how uncomfortable the destination. Genesis chapter 4, verse 3. In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground. Here we have the older brother, the farmer, bringing the product of his work. These are the fruits of the earth that he himself cultivated with the sweat of his brow. Notice what the text does not say. It does not say the offering was rotten. It does not say it was inferior. It does not say Cain brought it grudgingly or with a bad attitude. It does not say he held back the best for himself and only brought the leftovers. The text simply states the fact. Cain brought an offering from his harvest. This was what he had to offer. This was the fruit of his labor. Now verse 4, "And Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and of their fat portions, and the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering." Here we see the younger brother, the shepherd, bringing animals from his flock. The text specifies that these were the firstborn and includes their fat portions. Some interpreters have seized on this detail, arguing that because the text mentions Abel brought the firstborn with the fat, this proves his offering was superior to Cain's. But this interpretation is reaching for justification where none exists in the text itself. The text does not state that Cain failed to bring the first fruits of his harvest. It does not say he brought second-rate produce while Abel brought premium livestock. The text simply describes Abel's offering in more specific detail. This is a narrative choice made by the author, not evidence that one offering was objectively better than the other. Writers often provide more detail about some elements of a story than others. This does not mean the elements described with less detail are inferior. It simply means the author chose to emphasize certain details over others. But even if we were to grant for the sake of argument that Abel's offering was somehow of higher quality, this would still not explain or justify what happens next, because quality of the offering is not the issue. The issue is what happens in verse 4 and 5, and more importantly, what does not happen. Verse 4 continues, and verse 5 begins. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard. Stop right here. Read this line over and over again until the sheer arbitrariness of it strikes you with full force. God had regard for Abel. God had no regard for Cain. Why? The text does not tell us. It offers no explanation, no justification, no moral reasoning, no theological principle. It is simply stated as bare fact. God favored one brother and rejected the other. This is not a minor detail we can brush past. This is the moment where everything falls apart. This is where the moral foundation of the entire story crumbles. Because what we have here is an act of pure, naked, arbitrary favoritism. God chooses to accept one offering and reject another, without providing any reason that either the characters in the story or we as readers can understand. There is no principle we can extract from this. There is no lesson about what makes an offering acceptable. There is only the raw exercise of divine preference, without explanation or accountability. Think about what this means. If you were Cain, what would you learn from this experience? Would you know what you did wrong? Would you understand how to do better next time? Would you have any clear guidance about what God expects? No. You would only know one thing. God prefers your brother and not you, and you would have absolutely no idea why. Now, let us put ourselves fully in Cain's position. You have worked the land. You have broken the soil with your tools. You have planted seeds carefully. You have waited through seasons of growth. You have protected your crops. You have harvested the fruits with your own hands. You have brought them to God with sincerity and devotion, expecting that your honest labor would be received with approval. And then, without any warning, without any explanation that makes sense, God rejects what you have brought. Your brother's offering is accepted. Yours is not. Not because you did anything wrong that you can identify, not because you broke any rule that you knew about, not because you failed in any way that anyone can explain to you, simply because God made a choice, and that choice was not in your favor. How would any person with normal human emotions respond to this? The answer is given to us in verse 5. So Cain was very angry, and his face fell. Here we see the honest human response to unjust treatment. Cain is not angry because he is evil by nature. He is not angry because he loves sin and hates righteousness. He is angry because he has been treated unfairly. He has been publicly humiliated without cause. He has been rejected by the highest authority in his world, and that rejection came without explanation or justification. His anger is not a character flaw, it is a rational emotional response to experiencing injustice. Anyone who has ever been treated unfairly knows exactly how Cain feels in this moment. Anyone who has been passed over for a promotion they deserved, while someone less qualified was advanced, knows this feeling. Anyone who has been rejected by a parent who showed favoritism to a sibling knows this feeling. It is the feeling of being on the wrong side of arbitrary power. It is the feeling of being disfavored by an authority you cannot question, and it burns. But here is where the story takes an even darker turn. Because God, who created this entire situation, who rejected Cain without explanation, who showed favoritism without justification, does not respond with understanding or clarification. Instead, God responds by blaming Cain for his emotional reaction to being treated unjustly. Verse 6 and 7. The Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry, and why has your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is contrary to you, but you must rule over it." Let us analyze this divine response very carefully, because it is a masterclass in what modern psychology calls victim blaming. First, God asks Cain why he is angry. This is asked as if Cain's anger is irrational or unjustified, as if Cain has no legitimate reason to be upset, as if being arbitrarily rejected by God is not sufficient cause for emotional distress. Imagine a parent who treats one child differently than another for no reason, and when the disfavored child becomes upset, the parent asks, "Why are you upset?" The question itself is cruel because it denies the validity of the child's natural emotional response to unfair treatment. God does not say, "You are right to feel hurt, let me explain my reasoning to you." God does not offer comfort or clarification. God does not acknowledge that He created a situation that would naturally lead to these emotions. Instead, God questions the legitimacy of Cain's anger itself, as if feeling angry about injustice is wrong. Then comes the truly insidious part. If you do well, will you not be accepted? What does this mean? What is the well that Cain is supposed to do? What specifically is Cain failing to do? God does not say. The text does not clarify. We are left with a vague, nebulous accusation that places all responsibility on Cain without giving him any concrete guidance about what he needs to change. This is psychological manipulation of the most harmful kind. It is like a teacher giving a student a failing grade, and when the student asks what they did wrong, the teacher responds, "If you did good work, you would have passed." But what was wrong with the work? What needs to be improved? The teacher does not say. The student is left feeling like a failure without any clear understanding of how to succeed. This is not correction. This is condemnation without guidance. It is blame without instruction. Think about what this does to Cain psychologically. He came to God with an offering made in good faith. God rejected it without explanation. Cain naturally feels hurt and angry. And now God is telling him that his feelings are his own fault, that if he just did well, he would be accepted. But God will not explain what doing well actually means. Cain is caught in an impossible situation. He is being held responsible for meeting standards that have not been clearly communicated to him. He is being blamed for failing to do something that nobody has explained to him how to do. This is exactly how arbitrary authority maintains power. It keeps people off balance by never clearly stating the rules. It blames people for failing to meet standards that were never clearly defined. It makes people feel that their suffering is their own fault, even when the system itself is unjust. This is not divine justice, this is divine tyranny. Finally, God warns Cain. Sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is contrary to you, but you must rule over it. Now God is warning Cain about sin. But let us be very clear about what has happened here. God created a situation of injustice. God rejected Cain without cause. God favored Abel arbitrarily. God refused to explain his actions. God blamed Cain for having a natural emotional response to this treatment. And now God is warning Cain that sin is waiting to attack him. But who created the conditions that make sin attractive? Who planted the seed of resentment by showing arbitrary favoritism? Who watered that seed by refusing to explain or justify his actions? Who fertilized it by blaming the victim for his hurt feelings? God did all of these things. And then God warns Cain about the consequences of the very situation that God himself created. This is like pushing someone to the edge of a cliff and then warning them not to fall. This is like creating a powder keg and then warning someone not to light a match. This is like intentionally provoking someone and then telling them they better control their temper. The warning is not care or concern. It is shifting responsibility from the one who created the danger to the one who is in danger. And notice what God does not do. God does not remove the injustice. God does not explain his favoritism. God does not treat Cain fairly going forward. God does not acknowledge any responsibility for creating this toxic situation. God simply tells Cain to deal with his emotions and master the temptation to sin. as if the whole problem is Cain's internal state and not the external injustice that provoked it. This is the setup for tragedy. This is how violence is born, not from inherent evil in Cain's heart, but from a situation of injustice that was created by the highest authority, maintained by that authority, and never addressed or corrected by that authority. When people are treated unfairly and their complaints are dismissed, when their hurt is invalidated and their anger is condemned, when they are blamed for their response to mistreatment rather than the mistreatment being corrected, violence becomes not just possible, but probable. What we have in these verses is not a story of a righteous God dealing with a wicked man. What we have is a story of arbitrary authority creating the perfect conditions for disaster and then blaming the victim when disaster inevitably occurs. This is the truth that the text reveals when we read it honestly, without the filters of religious tradition telling us what we must believe it means. Now we arrive at the moment that defines this entire story, the moment of violence, the moment when brother raises his hand against brother and the first human blood is spilled on the earth. Genesis chapter 4 verse 8 tells us what happens next. Cain spoke to Abel his brother, and when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. This is the act that traditional interpretations use to prove that Cain was evil all along. This is the crime that, in the standard telling, reveals Cain's true wicked nature. This is the moment that supposedly justifies God's earlier rejection of Cain's offering, as if God knew in advance what kind of person Cain was. But this interpretation requires us to ignore everything that came before. It requires us to forget the chain of events that led to this field, to this moment, to this act of violence. It requires us to pretend that this murder appeared out of nowhere, from pure evil in Cain's heart, rather than being the predictable result of a situation that God himself created. Let us trace the causal chain clearly, step by step, so there can be no confusion about how we arrived at this tragedy. Step 1. God shows arbitrary favoritism between two brothers. He accepts one brother's offering and rejects the other brother's offering without providing any explanation, justification, or moral reason. This creates a situation of fundamental injustice. One brother is favored for no reason that anyone can understand. The other brother is rejected for no fault that anyone can identify. Step 2. The rejected brother, Cain, experiences the natural human emotional response to being treated unjustly. He becomes angry. His face falls. He feels hurt, confused, and resentful. These are not evil emotions. These are healthy responses to experiencing unfairness. Any psychologist will tell you that anger in response to injustice is appropriate and normal. It is what motivates people to fight against unfair systems. It is what drives the demand for equal treatment. Cain's anger is not evidence of a wicked heart. It is evidence of a heart that recognizes and reacts to injustice. Step 3. God does not correct the injustice. God does not explain his actions. God does not treat Cain fairly. Instead, God blames Cain for being angry. God asks Cain why he is upset, as if his feelings are irrational. God tells Cain vaguely to do well, without explaining what that means. God warns Cain about sin without acknowledging that God himself created the conditions that make sin tempting. God, in other words, adds insult to injury. He not only treats Cain unfairly, but also makes Cain feel that his hurt feelings are his own fault. Step 4. Cain's anger, which has been dismissed and invalidated by God, has nowhere to go. He cannot challenge God directly. God is the supreme authority. God does not explain himself. God does not listen to complaints. God does not correct injustices. So where does Cain's anger go? It goes toward the person who benefited from the injustice. It goes toward Abel, the favored brother, not because Abel did anything wrong, but because Abel represents everything that Cain is not. Abel is accepted. Abel is favored. Abel is the one God chose. And in Cain's mind, distorted by hurt and anger, Abel becomes the obstacle to his own acceptance. Step 5. The violence erupts. Cain kills Abel. This is the tragic, terrible, inevitable result of the situation that God created. Notice that I said inevitable. Some people will object to this word. They will say that Cain had a choice. They will say that Cain could have controlled himself. They will say that nothing made Cain murder his brother. And in a narrow technical sense, they are right. Cain did make a choice to commit violence. But let us be honest about the context of that choice. When you create a situation of profound injustice, when you favor one person arbitrarily over another, when you refuse to explain or justify your actions, when you dismiss the hurt feelings of the one you have wronged, when you create competition and resentment where there should be brotherhood, you are creating the conditions for violence. You may not pull the trigger yourself, but you have loaded the gun. You may not strike the blow yourself, but you have positioned the weapon and pointed it at the target. You may not commit the act yourself, but you bear responsibility for making it likely. This is not speculation. This is basic human psychology that we can observe throughout history and in our own lives. When parents show favoritism between children, those children often develop resentment toward each other. When teachers treat students unequally without reason, students compete against each other rather than cooperating. When employers advance some workers while holding others back without fair criteria, workplace relationships become toxic. When societies divide people into favored and disfavored groups, violence between those groups becomes almost inevitable. This pattern plays out over and over again because it is built into how human beings respond to injustice. God, if he is truly all-knowing, would understand this. God would know that showing arbitrary favoritism between brothers would create resentment. God would know that rejecting someone without explanation would create anger. God would know that dismissing that anger would make it fester and grow. God would know that all of these factors together would create a powder keg ready to explode. And yet God did all of these things anyway. In philosophy, there is a concept called the prime mover. The prime mover is the first cause in a chain of events. It is the initial action that sets everything else in motion. In the story of Cain and Abel, who is the prime mover? Who initiated the chain of events that led to murder? It was not Cain. Cain was simply bringing an offering like his brother. It was God. God made the choice to reject Cain. God made the choice not to explain why. God made the choice to blame Cain for his emotional response. God set all of this in motion. God is the prime mover of this tragedy. Now we come to the aftermath of the murder, and what we find there is even more disturbing. Genesis chapter 4 verse 9. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Where is your brother Abel?" He said, "I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper?" Notice that God asks this question as if he does not already know what happened. This is strange for a being who is supposed to be all-knowing, but let us set that aside. What is more interesting is Cain's response. Traditional interpretations read Cain's answer as defiant, as an attempt to deflect responsibility, as evidence of his unrepentant heart. But read it again without that assumption. Am I my brother's keeper? This is actually a profound question. Cain is essentially asking, is it my responsibility to protect my brother from the consequences of your favoritism? Is it my job to manage the situation that you created? You are the one who set us against each other. You are the one who favored him over me for no reason. And now you are asking me where he is? Of course, this does not justify the murder. Nothing justifies taking another person's life. But it does point to something important. Cain is recognizing, perhaps only dimly and through his own guilt and pain, that he is not the only one responsible for what happened. The system that created the conditions for this violence bears responsibility too. But God does not acknowledge this. Genesis chapter 4 verses 10 through 12. And the Lord said, "What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. And now you are cursed from the ground which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it shall no longer yield to you its strength. You shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. God curses Cain, God punishes him, God sends him away, and all of this is appropriate if we are looking only at the murder itself. Cain did kill his brother. Cain must face consequences for that action. But notice what God does not do. God does not acknowledge his own role in creating this situation. God does not say, "I recognize that my actions contributed to your anger, though that does not excuse what you have done." God does not take any responsibility for showing arbitrary favoritism. God does not apologize for the injustice that started this whole chain of events. This is the classic pattern of abusive authority. The authority figure creates a toxic situation. The people caught in that situation act out in harmful ways. The authority figure then punishes the people for their actions without ever acknowledging or correcting the toxic situation that the authority created in the first place. The blame flows downward. The responsibility is placed entirely on those with the least power. The one with the most power, the one who set everything in motion, walks away clean. If Cain is guilty of murder, and he clearly is, then what is God guilty of? God is guilty of creating the conditions that made murder likely. God is guilty of showing favoritism without justification. God is guilty of refusing to explain his actions. God is guilty of invalidating the natural emotional response to injustice. God is guilty of warning about consequences without correcting the underlying problem. God is guilty of setting two brothers against each other through arbitrary preference. Does this make God a murderer? No, Cain killed Abel with his own hands. Cain made that choice. Cain bears the primary responsibility for that act. But God is complicit. God is the one who loaded the gun, even if Cain pulled the trigger. God is the one who created the conditions, even if Cain committed the act. And this complicity matters because it changes the entire moral framework of the story. We cannot simply say that Cain was evil and God was righteous. We have to acknowledge that God created a situation of injustice and then blamed the victims when that injustice led to violence. We have to recognize that arbitrary authority, even when that authority is divine, produces predictable harm. We have to admit that this story is not a simple tale of good versus evil, but a complex tragedy in which the highest authority figure bears significant responsibility for the outcome. This is what the text reveals when we read it honestly. This is what we see when we examine it with reason instead of with blind faith. And this is why this story matters so much. Because if we can recognize God's complicity in this ancient text, we can recognize the complicity of human authorities who create unjust situations and then blame those who suffer under those situations for their responses. We can stop accepting that those in power have the right to act arbitrarily without accountability. We can demand that authority justify itself rationally, rather than simply asserting its right to command obedience. Now that we have examined the text itself and seen the problems it contains, we need a framework for understanding what this story actually reveals. We need tools for interpreting it in a way that makes sense, that is honest about its flaws, and that allows us to learn from it without accepting its injustices as divine truth. This is where the philosophy of Baruch Spinoza becomes essential. Spinoza was a Jewish philosopher who lived in Amsterdam in the 1600s. He was excommunicated from his community at the age of 23 for asking dangerous questions about the Bible and about God. He spent the rest of his life developing a philosophical system that challenged almost everything that traditional religion taught. He was threatened, attacked, and marginalized. His books were banned. His ideas were declared heretical, but he continued his work because he believed that human freedom depended on our ability to think clearly about God, about Scripture, and about morality, without being controlled by fear and superstition. Spinoza's most radical idea was his concept of God. He rejected completely the idea of God as a person, the God of traditional religion, the God who has emotions and preferences and favorites, the God who gets angry and shows mercy and makes decisions based on what pleases him. This God does not exist according to Spinoza. Instead, Spinoza argued that God is identical with nature itself. God is not a being separate from the universe who created it and now governs it from outside. God is the rational structure of reality. God is the laws of nature. God is the necessary order according to which everything exists and operates. This means that the true God, the God who actually exists, does not have favorites. God does not prefer some people over others. God does not accept some offerings and reject others based on personal taste. The real God, which is nature, which is reality itself, operates according to universal principles that apply to everyone equally. The sun shines on the righteous and the wicked alike. Gravity affects saints and sinners the same way. The laws of nature do not play favorites because they are not personal beings with preferences. They are simply the way things are. So if the real God does not show favoritism, where does the God of the Bible come from? The God who clearly does show favoritism in the story of Cain and Abel? Spinoza's answer is clear and radical. The God of the Bible is a human projection. The biblical authors were human beings living in specific times and places with specific experiences and specific limitations. They wrote about God the way they understood God, based on their own human psychology and their own social experiences. And what they experienced in their world was hierarchy, arbitrary authority, and favoritism. They lived under kings who could promote or punish without needing to explain themselves. They lived in tribal societies where some people were favored and others were not, often for reasons that had nothing to do with merit or justice. So when these ancient authors tried to describe God, they projected their human experience onto the cosmic level. They created a God who acts like the authorities they knew, a God who can choose favorites without explanation, a God who can reject people arbitrarily, a God who demands obedience without needing to justify his commands. In other words, they created a God in the image of human rulers, rather than understanding God as the rational order of nature that treats all things according to universal laws. This understanding transforms how we read the story of Cain and Abel. The God who arbitrarily favors Abel over Cain is not the real God. It is a character in a story written by human beings who are trying to make sense of their experience of injustice and favoritism by projecting it onto the divine level. The story is not describing how the real God actually behaves. It is revealing how the authors understood God based on their limited human perspective. But here is what makes this story valuable, even though its portrayal of God is flawed. The story accidentally reveals something true about how arbitrary favoritism leads to violence. Even though the authors probably intended to show that Cain was wicked and deserved rejection, what they actually showed, perhaps without meaning to, is how injustice creates the conditions for violence. They showed how favoritism breeds resentment. They showed how authority figures who refuse to explain themselves create confusion and anger. They showed how blaming victims for their response to mistreatment makes situations worse rather than better. In trying to justify God's actions, they accidentally exposed the problems with those actions. This brings us to Spinoza's views on Scripture itself. In his book, The Theological Political Treatise, Spinoza argued that the Bible should not be read as if it were written directly by God with perfect knowledge and perfect morality. It should be read as a collection of human documents, written by people in particular historical contexts. These documents reflect the understanding, the prejudices, the cultural assumptions, and the psychological experiences of their authors. They contain wisdom in some places and errors in other places. They record both moral insights and moral failures. And we should analyze them the same way we analyze any historical document, with careful attention to what they reveal about the people who wrote them and the times in which they lived. This does not mean the Bible has no value. It means we should not treat it as infallible. We should not accept everything it says as if it must be true simply because it appears in a religious text. We should use our reason to examine what it teaches and keep what is good while recognizing and rejecting what is harmful. In the case of Cain and Abel, we should recognize that the story contains a harmful portrayal of God as an arbitrary authority who shows favoritism. and we should reject that portrayal while learning from what the story accidentally reveals about the dynamics of injustice and violence. Now let us turn to Spinoza's understanding of ethics and morality. Traditional religious morality says that good and evil are determined by God's commands. Something is good because God commands it, something is evil because God forbids it. And we must obey these commands whether or not we understand them, whether or not they make rational sense, simply because God has the authority to command and we have the obligation to obey. This is called divine command theory, and Spinoza rejected it completely. According to Spinoza, true morality does not come from obeying arbitrary commands from an authority figure. True morality comes from understanding what promotes human flourishing and what hinders it. We can figure out, through reason and experience, what kinds of actions lead to good outcomes for human beings and what kinds of actions lead to harm. We do not need a divine commander to tell us that showing arbitrary favoritism is harmful. We can see through observation and reason that favoritism creates resentment, damages relationships, and leads to conflict. We do not need God to command us to treat people fairly. We can understand through rational reflection that fairness promotes social harmony and cooperation while unfairness breeds discord and violence. This means that even divine actions, even things that God supposedly does or commands, can and should be judged by rational moral standards. If the God of a story shows arbitrary favoritism, we can recognize that as morally wrong, even if the story presents it as acceptable. If the God of a story refuses to explain his actions and blames victims for their hurt feelings, we can identify that as harmful behavior, even if the story treats it as righteous. We do not have to accept injustice simply because it is attributed to God. In fact, if we truly care about morality, we must be willing to criticize even portrayals of God when those portrayals depict immoral behavior. Apply this framework to the story of Cain and Abel. Does God's arbitrary favoritism promote human flourishing? No, it creates resentment and competition between brothers. Does God's refusal to explain his rejection of Cain promote understanding and growth? No, it creates confusion and anger. Does God's blaming of Cain for his emotional response to injustice promote healing and justice? No, it adds insult to injury and makes the situation worse. Therefore, by rational moral standards, by standards based on what actually promotes human well-being, God's actions in this story are wrong. Not just mysterious or hard to understand, but actually morally wrong. This is a radical conclusion, and many religious people will find it deeply uncomfortable. But it is the conclusion that honest moral reasoning forces us to accept. If we believe that morality means anything at all, if we believe that fairness and justice are real values and not just arbitrary preferences, then we must be willing to apply those values consistently. We cannot say that fairness matters for human beings, but not for God. We cannot say that explaining your actions is important for parents and teachers, but not for the divine. Either moral principles are universal, or they are not principles at all, but simply expressions of whoever happens to have power. Spinoza also taught about human freedom and what it means to be free. According to Spinoza, we are enslaved when we act out of emotions we do not understand, when we obey authorities whose commands we cannot rationally justify, when we are driven by fear and superstition rather than guided by reason and understanding. True freedom comes when we act based on clear understanding of what is truly good for us and for others. Freedom is not doing whatever we want. Freedom is understanding what we should want based on reason. Apply this to how we read Scripture. If we accept the story of Cain and Abel at face value, if we simply believe that God had the right to show arbitrary favoritism and that Cain was wrong to feel hurt by it, then we are enslaved. We are accepting arbitrary authority without understanding. We are allowing our moral thinking to be shaped by a story that portrays injustice as acceptable. We are teaching ourselves to submit to unfair treatment rather than to recognize and resist it. This is not freedom. This is intellectual and moral bondage. But if we read the story with reason, If we recognize that the God portrayed in it behaves unjustly by any rational moral standard, if we refuse to accept that favoritism and victim-blaming are acceptable just because they are attributed to the divine, then we are free. We are thinking for ourselves. We are applying consistent moral principles. We are refusing to let ancient texts control our moral reasoning. This is the freedom that Spinoza offered, and it is the freedom that humanity desperately needs. The implications of this Spinoziast reading extend far beyond one Bible story. Throughout history, people have justified terrible injustices by claiming they were doing God's will. Slavery was defended as divinely ordained because the Bible seemed to accept it. The subjugation of women was justified as God's design because Scripture portrayed it. Colonialism was presented as spreading God's truth to inferior peoples. Wars were fought in God's name. Hierarchies were maintained by claiming they reflected divine order. In every case, the logic was the same. If God can act arbitrarily, if God can establish hierarchies without rational justification, if God can favor some and reject others without explanation, then human authorities can claim the same privileges by saying they represent God's will. This is why it matters so much that we recognize the flaws in stories like Cain and Abel. When we accept that the God of the story acts unjustly, when we acknowledge that arbitrary favoritism is wrong even when attributed to the divine, we remove one of the pillars that has supported human injustice for thousands of years. We say clearly that no authority, divine or human, has the right to act arbitrarily without accountability. We establish that moral principles apply to everyone, including God, as portrayed in our sacred texts. We free ourselves to build systems based on reason and fairness, rather than on submission to unexplained commands from authorities we are told not to question. This does not mean destroying spirituality or rejecting the idea of God completely. It means purifying our concept of God. It means moving from the anthropomorphic God who acts like a capricious human ruler to the Spinozist God, who is the rational structure of reality itself. It means moving from morality based on obedience to arbitrary commands to morality based on understanding what truly promotes human flourishing. It means moving from intellectual slavery to intellectual freedom. And it means moving from accepting the injustices in our sacred texts to honestly confronting them so we can learn to build a more just world. Now that we have established a framework for understanding this story through the lens of reason rather than blind faith, let us explore what happens when we read it in different ways. What do we gain by rejecting the traditional interpretation? What new insights become available when we are willing to see the flaws in the text rather than explaining them away? What changes in our understanding of morality, justice, and authority when we apply critical thinking to sacred narratives? The first alternative reading we can apply is to see this story as a revelation of ancient human psychology rather than as an accurate description of divine behavior. The authors of Genesis were human beings who lived in a world of hierarchy, favoritism, and arbitrary authority. They experienced injustice. They knew what it felt like to be disfavored for reasons they could not understand. They lived under rulers who did not need to explain their decisions. They witnessed violence that erupted from resentment and perceived unfairness. When they wrote about God, they projected these human experiences onto the cosmic level because they had no other framework for understanding divine power. Read this way, the story of Cain and Abel is not telling us how God actually behaves. It is telling us how ancient people understood their world and their experience of injustice. It reveals their fear of arbitrary authority. It shows their struggle to make sense of why some people seem favored while others seem cursed. It captures the rage that comes from being on the wrong side of unexplained preference. The value of the story, then, is not in what it teaches us about God, but in what it reveals about the human condition and the universal experience of feeling unfairly treated. When we read it this way, we can have compassion for the authors without accepting their theology as truth. We can understand that they were doing their best to explain a confusing and often unjust world. We can learn from their psychological insights about how favoritism breeds violence, while rejecting their conclusion that such favoritism is acceptable when it comes from God. We honor their humanity without being bound by their limitations. The second alternative reading is to see this story as an accidental critique of the entire sacrificial system. Think about what the story actually shows us. Two brothers bring offerings to God, competing for divine approval. The criteria for acceptance are unclear. One is accepted, the other rejected, and the rejection leads directly to violence. What if the real lesson here is not about individual morality, but about the dangers of any system that encourages people to compete for the approval of an authority whose standards are not clearly explained? The sacrificial system of ancient religion was based on the idea that God required offerings, and that these offerings could influence divine favor. But this creates a competitive dynamic. Everyone is trying to please God, but nobody knows for sure what will please God. Some offerings are accepted, others rejected, and the reasons are often mysterious. This uncertainty creates anxiety. The competition for divine favor creates resentment between people who should be cooperating rather than competing. And when someone is rejected while another is accepted, violence becomes possible. Read this way, the story of Cain and Abel is not justifying the sacrificial system. It is exposing the fundamental problem with it. It is showing us that any system based on competing for the approval of an unpredictable authority will eventually lead to conflict and violence. This reading sees the story not as divinely inspired moral instruction, but as an early form of religious criticism, perhaps even written by someone who was skeptical about whether trying to manipulate God through offerings was a good idea in the first place. The third alternative reading is to see this as a universal political story about how authority creates violence through favoritism. Strip away the religious language for a moment. What do we have? We have two people who are equally deserving of approval. An authority figure favors one without explanation and rejects the other. The rejected person becomes angry. The authority blames the rejected person for their anger rather than addressing the unfairness. The rejected person's anger has nowhere to go except toward the favored person. Violence erupts. The authority punishes the violent person without ever acknowledging that the authority created the conditions for violence. This pattern is not unique to ancient religious texts. It plays out in families where parents have obvious favorites. It plays out in workplaces where managers promote some employees while holding others back for reasons that have nothing to do with performance. It plays out in schools where teachers treat some students better than others. It plays out in societies where some groups are systematically favored while others are systematically excluded. And in every case, the result is the same. Resentment builds, competition replaces cooperation. Those who are disfavored either turn their anger inward and suffer, or they turn it outward and lash out, often at others who are also victims of the same unjust system, rather than at the authority that created the injustice in the first place. Understanding the story of Cain and Abel as a universal political lesson allows us to apply it to countless situations in our own lives and in our societies. It teaches us that authority figures who act arbitrarily create violence. It teaches us that systems based on unclear or unfair criteria damage everyone involved. It teaches us that when people are treated unjustly and their complaints are dismissed, violence becomes not just possible but likely. And it teaches us that we cannot simply blame individuals for their violent responses without also examining the systems that provoked those responses. So, what do we gain by reading the story in these alternative ways? First, we gain moral clarity. We no longer have to twist ourselves into knots trying to justify God's arbitrary favoritism. We no longer have to pretend that Cain was purely evil and bore all responsibility for what happened. We can call injustice what it is, even when that injustice appears in our most sacred texts. We can be honest about the moral problems in the story rather than explaining them away. Second, we gain intellectual honesty. We do not have to read things into the text that are not there in order to make God look good. We do not have to invent explanations for God's behavior that the text itself does not provide. We can simply acknowledge what the text actually says and recognize that what it says is morally problematic. This kind of honesty is essential for any genuine engagement with ancient texts. If we cannot be honest about their flaws, we cannot truly learn from them. Third, we gain emotional integrity. We can validate anger at injustice as a healthy and appropriate response, rather than as a sinful emotion that must be suppressed. We can recognize that when people feel hurt by unfair treatment, their feelings are legitimate and should be addressed by correcting the unfairness, not by telling them to get over it. This has profound implications for how we treat people in our own lives and how we respond when people express anger about injustice in our society. Fourth, we gain a better foundation for ethics. When we recognize that even actions attributed to God can be morally wrong, we establish that moral principles are truly universal. Fairness matters for everyone. Justice matters for everyone. Explanation and accountability matter for everyone. There are no exceptions based on power or authority. This creates a much more solid ethical foundation than one that says some beings are exempt from moral standards because of their status. Fifth, we gain freedom. Freedom from the fear of a capricious deity who might favor or reject us for no reason we can understand. Freedom from the obligation to defend the indefensible just because it appears in Scripture. Freedom from systems that demand our submission without offering justification. Freedom to think clearly about morality without having our reasoning clouded by the assumption that whatever God does must automatically be right. This is the freedom that Spinoza fought for, and it is as valuable today as it was in his time. Finally, we gain empowerment. When we recognize that authority must justify itself rationally, we are empowered to question authority in all its forms. We are empowered to demand fairness from those who have power over us. We are empowered to resist systems that treat people unequally without good reason. We are empowered to build better systems based on principles of justice that we can actually understand and defend. This is not just theoretical philosophy. This is practical wisdom that can change how we live and how we structure our societies. But here is what we do not lose by reading the story this way. We do not lose spirituality. We can still believe in something greater than ourselves, something that gives meaning and purpose to existence. We just reconceptualize what that something is. Instead of a personal deity with moods and favorites, we can understand the divine as the rational structure of reality, as the interconnection of all things, as the source of the moral principles that emerge from understanding how human beings can flourish together. We do not lose God. We purify our understanding of God by removing the human projections that have made God seem petty, arbitrary, and cruel. We move toward a more elevated concept of the divine that is worthy of worship because it represents true justice, true consistency, true universality, not the favoritism and caprice of the God portrayed in this story. We do not lose morality. In fact, we strengthen the foundations of morality by grounding it in reason and human flourishing, rather than in arbitrary commands from an authority we are told not to question. A morality based on understanding is more stable, more defensible, and more genuinely good than a morality based on blind obedience. We do not lose the value of Scripture. We simply learn to engage with it more honestly and more critically. We can appreciate its wisdom while acknowledging its flaws. We can learn from both its insights and its errors. We treat it as a human document worthy of study, rather than as an infallible divine revelation that must be accepted without question. This is what becomes possible when we read the story of Cain and Abel with the eyes of reason rather than the eyes of blind faith. We open up new ways of understanding. We gain tools for analyzing power and injustice. We free ourselves from harmful narratives while preserving the genuine wisdom that can be found even in flawed texts. And we position ourselves to build a better future based on principles of justice and fairness that apply to everyone, including the divine. The story of Cain and Abel is not just an ancient tale about two brothers at the dawn of humanity. It is a mirror that reflects dynamics we see in our world every single day. The patterns it reveals about favoritism, injustice, resentment, and violence play out continuously in our families, our workplaces, our institutions, and our societies. Understanding these patterns gives us practical tools for creating more just and peaceful environments in every area of our lives. Let us start with family dynamics, because this is where most of us first encounter the experience of fairness or unfairness. Parents who show favoritism between their children, whether intentionally or unconsciously, create exactly the same dynamic that God created between Cain and Abel. The favored child may not have done anything to earn that favor. The disfavored child may not have done anything to deserve that treatment. But the favoritism itself creates competition, resentment, and conflict between siblings who should be natural allies. Children who feel unfairly treated by their parents often direct their anger not at the parents who have the power, but at their siblings who are favored. This is exactly what happened with Cain and Abel. Cain could not challenge God directly, so his rage turned toward Abel. In the same way, children often cannot directly confront their parents about unfair treatment, so they take out their hurt and anger on each other. The parent then blames the children for fighting without ever examining whether the parent's own behavior created the conditions for that conflict. The lesson for parents is clear. If you want your children to love and support each other, you must treat them fairly. This does not mean treating them identically, because children have different needs. But it does mean that when you make different decisions for different children, you explain your reasoning. You make sure each child understands that they are valued equally, even if they are treated differently in specific situations. You never create a situation where one child feels arbitrarily favored while another feels arbitrarily rejected. And if a child expresses hurt about feeling unfairly treated, you listen to that hurt and address it, rather than dismissing it or blaming the child for having hurt feelings. This same principle applies in workplace and institutional settings. Managers and leaders who show favoritism create toxic environments. When some employees are promoted while others are passed over and the criteria for advancement are unclear or seem arbitrary, resentment builds throughout the organization. People who feel unfairly treated do not perform their best work. They may sabotage the favored employees. They may leave the organization entirely. They may stay but become bitter and disengaged, doing the minimum required and nothing more. The pattern repeats itself endlessly. An authority figure makes decisions that seem arbitrary to those affected. The disfavored individuals or groups feel hurt and angry. The authority figure dismisses those feelings or blames people for having them, rather than examining whether the decisions were actually fair. The resentment grows, productivity suffers, relationships deteriorate, and the authority figure wonders why people are not more grateful, more cooperative, more committed, never recognizing that the authority figure's own actions created the problem. The solution in workplace settings is the same as in families. Authority must justify itself rationally. When leaders make decisions about promotions, assignments, resources, or recognition, they must be able to explain those decisions based on clear, fair criteria that everyone can understand. When someone questions a decision, leaders must be willing to engage with that question honestly, rather than dismissing it as insubordination or lack of faith in leadership. In school, it was believed that insight forms the foundation of insubordination or lack of faith in leadership. And when mistakes are made, when someone is treated unfairly, leaders must be willing to acknowledge the error and correct it, rather than doubling down and blaming the person who was harmed. Now let us consider religious communities, because this is where the story of Cain and Abel has particularly dangerous implications. Many religious traditions teach that God has chosen people, that some individuals or groups are specially favored by the divine, while others are not. This theology of election or chosenness creates exactly the same in-group and out-group dynamics that we see in the Cain and Abel story. Those who believe they are chosen feel entitled to special treatment. Those who are defined as not chosen feel excluded, diminished, and often resentful. Throughout history, this belief in divine favoritism has justified terrible treatment of the supposedly unchosen. If God favors us over them, then we can conquer their lands, enslave their people, force them to convert, or simply treat them as less worthy of respect and dignity. The logic is always the same. God plays favorites. We are his favorites. Therefore we can treat others as inferior. The story of Cain and Abel, when read traditionally, reinforces this dangerous pattern by teaching that God's favoritism is acceptable, and that those who object to it are in the wrong. But when we read the story critically, when we recognize that arbitrary favoritism is harmful even when attributed to God, we undermine this entire structure. We can say clearly that no group should claim special divine favor as justification for treating other groups unfairly. We can insist that all human beings deserve equal dignity and equal rights, regardless of their religious identity. We can build religious communities based on universal principles of compassion and justice rather than on claims of special status. In political systems, the lessons from this story are equally important. When laws are created and enforced arbitrarily, when some citizens are treated better than others without clear and fair reasons, when authority does not need to justify itself to those it governs, social cohesion breaks down. People lose faith in institutions. They stop cooperating with systems they perceive as rigged against them. Resentment builds between groups who are treated differently, and eventually conflict becomes inevitable. We see this pattern in societies with deep inequalities that are not addressed. We see it when police treat some communities differently than others. We see it when courts hand down different sentences for the same crimes based on factors that should be irrelevant like race or wealth. We see it when politicians favor their supporters with resources and opportunities while ignoring the needs of those who did not vote for them. In every case, the dynamic is the same. Arbitrary or unfair treatment by authority creates justified anger. That anger, when dismissed or suppressed rather than addressed, eventually erupts in destructive ways. And then those in power blame the angry people for their response rather than examining the injustice that provoked the response. The solution, in political contexts, is to build systems where authority is accountable, where laws apply equally to everyone, where decisions must be justified by clear principles rather than by the preferences of those in power, where people who are harmed by unfair treatment have meaningful recourse rather than being told to accept their situation, where anger at injustice is recognized as legitimate and responded to by correcting the injustice rather than by punishing the anger. This is what democracy at its best tries to achieve, and it is exactly what the God of the Cain and Abel story fails to do. The core lesson that applies across all these contexts is this: all authority must justify itself rationally. Whether we are talking about parents, managers, religious leaders, or government officials, those who have power over others have an obligation to exercise that power fairly and to be able to explain their decisions. Favoritism, without good reason, is always harmful. Treating people differently without clear and fair criteria always creates resentment. Dismissing complaints about unfair treatment always makes situations worse, and blaming those who respond to injustice with anger rather than correcting the injustice always leads to escalating conflict. Another crucial lesson is that those who react to injustice with anger are not the primary problem. The primary problem is the injustice itself. This does not mean that all responses to injustice are justified. Violence is still wrong. Harming innocent people is still wrong. But we must understand that when systems create injustice and then ignore or dismiss complaints about that injustice, they bear responsibility for the predictable consequences. We cannot simply blame individuals for their reactions while ignoring the systems that provoked those reactions. This means that when we see people expressing anger about unfair treatment, whether in our families, our workplaces, our religious communities, or our societies, our first response should not be to tell them to calm down or to accuse them of being too sensitive. Our first response should be to examine honestly whether their complaint has merit. Are they actually being treated unfairly? If so, what can we do to correct that unfairness? If we cannot find a genuine justification for the different treatment they are experiencing, then we need to change how we are treating them, not tell them to accept being treated poorly. Finally, this story teaches us about the danger of accepting narratives that justify injustice. For thousands of years, people have read the story of Cain and Abel and concluded that God's arbitrary favoritism was acceptable and Cain's anger was sinful. This acceptance has trained countless people to submit to unfair authority rather than to question it. It has taught people to blame themselves for feeling hurt when they are treated unjustly, rather than to recognize that their hurt is a healthy response to genuine wrong. It has perpetuated systems of injustice by making them seem divinely ordained and therefore unchangeable. But we do not have to accept these narratives anymore. We can read them critically. We can recognize the injustice they contain. We can refuse to let ancient texts dictate what we consider moral or immoral. We can build new systems based on principles we can actually defend rationally. And in doing so, we can create families, workplaces, religious communities, and societies that are genuinely more just, more peaceful, and more conducive to human flourishing than the world described in these ancient stories. Whenever we challenge traditional religious interpretations, especially ones that have been accepted for thousands of years, we can expect resistance. People will offer defenses of the traditional reading and objections to the critical analysis we have presented. It is important to address these counter-arguments directly and honestly, not to win a debate, but to show that we have genuinely engaged with the strongest defenses of the traditional view and found them lacking. Let us examine the most common objections, one by one. The first counter-argument is perhaps the most common. People will say that God's ways are higher than our ways, that we cannot understand divine reasoning with our limited human minds, and that we should simply trust that God had good reasons for favoring Abel, even if those reasons are not explained in the text. This sounds humble and faithful, but it is actually an intellectual surrender that destroys the possibility of meaningful moral reasoning. Think about what this argument actually means. It means that when we see what appears to be injustice, we must assume it is actually justice that we are too limited to understand. It means that God is exempt from the moral standards we apply to everyone else. It means that fairness, consistency, and explanation are important values for human beings, but not for God. But if this is true, then morality becomes meaningless. If the same action can be right when God does it and wrong when we do it, then there is no consistent moral principle at all. There is only power. Might makes right. And whoever has the most power can act however they want without needing to justify their actions. This is not a foundation for ethics. This is the destruction of ethics. If we truly believe in justice, in fairness, in the importance of treating people right, then these principles must apply universally. They cannot apply only to the weak while the strong are exempt. Either God is subject to moral principles, or those principles are not real principles, but only preferences that can be overridden by sufficient power. We cannot have it both ways. The second common objection is that Cain's offering was actually inferior to Abel's. People point to the detail that Abel brought the firstborn with their fat, suggesting this shows Abel brought his best, while Cain did not. But as we have already discussed, the text does not say that Cain failed to bring his best. It simply describes Abel's offering in more detail. This is reading something into the text that is not there in order to justify God's favoritism. But even if we grant for the sake of argument that Abel's offering was objectively better, this still does not solve the moral problem. A good teacher who receives substandard work from a student does not just reject it without explanation. The teacher explains what was wrong and how to improve. A good parent whose child brings them a gift that is not quite right does not just dismiss the child. The parent appreciates the effort and gently guides the child toward understanding what would be more appropriate. God does neither of these things. God simply rejects Cain without explanation, leaving Cain confused about what he did wrong and how to do better. This is not righteous judgment. This is poor communication that creates unnecessary confusion and hurt. The third objection is that the story is really about heart attitude rather than about the physical offerings. People claim that Abel had faith and brought his offering with the right spirit, while Cain had a bad attitude and brought his offering grudgingly or with wrong motives. But again, this is not in the text. There is nothing in the Genesis account that describes Cain's attitude before God rejected his offering. Cain only becomes angry after he is rejected, which is a natural response to perceived injustice. The idea that Cain had a bad heart from the beginning is an assumption read into the story to protect God from the charge of acting arbitrarily. It is not based on what the text actually says. Even if we accept that heart attitude matters, God never explains this to Cain. God never says, "Cain, your offering is being rejected because your heart is not right." Instead, God asks Cain why he is angry and tells him vaguely to do well, without specifying what doing well means or what was wrong with Cain's heart. If the lesson is about internal attitude, then a good teacher would make that lesson clear. God does not do this, which means even this interpretation does not absolve God of poor communication and arbitrary treatment. The fourth counter-argument is that this story is fundamentally about faith rather than about fairness. Defenders of the traditional view argue that God has the right to test our faith by acting in ways we do not understand, and that accepting God's decisions without question is itself a virtue. But this confuses blind obedience with genuine faith. Real faith, faith that is worthy of respect, is trust based on understanding and experience. If someone has shown themselves to be trustworthy, to be fair, to be consistent in applying good principles, then trusting them, even when you do not fully understand a particular decision, makes sense. But if someone acts arbitrarily, refuses to explain their actions, and blames you for being upset about unfair treatment, then blind trust in that person is not virtue. It is submission to tyranny. Moreover, this argument essentially says that God can be unjust and we should accept it as a test of faith. But why would a good God need to be unjust to test faith? Why would creating unnecessary confusion and hurt be a desirable way to evaluate someone's trust? A parent who intentionally treats their child unfairly just to see if the child will still love them is not a good parent. They are manipulative and abusive. We should expect more from God than we accept from human beings, not less. The fifth objection is that we are reading too much into the story, overanalyzing a simple narrative and creating problems where none exist. But we are not adding anything to the text. We are simply being honest about what is actually there and what is not there. The text does not explain why God rejected Cain. This is a fact. The text does not describe any sin or fault in Cain before the rejection. This is a fact. The text shows Cain becoming angry only after being rejected, which is a natural response. This is a fact. We are not inventing problems. We are acknowledging problems that are clearly present in the narrative when we read it honestly, without the filter of religious tradition telling us what we must believe it means. The traditional interpretation, by contrast, requires adding many things that are not in the text. It requires assuming that Cain's offering was inferior, even though this is not stated. It requires assuming that Cain had a bad attitude, even though this is not described. It requires assuming that God had good reasons for his favoritism, even though these reasons are never given. The traditional reading is the one that reads things into the text, not the critical reading. The final common objection is that this kind of analysis undermines faith and attacks religion. But this is not true. What this analysis undermines is blind faith. Faith that refuses to ask honest questions. Faith that requires accepting injustice as justice simply because it is attributed to God. What it attacks is not religion itself, but particular harmful interpretations of religious texts. There is a profound difference between destroying faith and purifying it. We are not saying people should not believe in God or should not find meaning in Scripture. We are saying they should not accept interpretations that portray God as unjust and arbitrary. A faith that cannot withstand honest questioning is a fragile faith that probably should be challenged. A faith that grows stronger through honest examination, that is willing to admit when traditional interpretations are morally problematic, that can evolve to better reflect genuine justice and compassion. This is a mature faith worthy of respect. We do religion no favors by protecting it from criticism. We strengthen it by subjecting it to the same rigorous analysis we apply to everything else that matters in human life. These counter-arguments, when examined carefully, do not save the traditional interpretation. They either require us to abandon consistent moral principles, or they require us to read things into the text that are not there, or they confuse blind obedience with genuine virtue. The critical reading we have offered remains the most honest account of what the story actually says and the most morally coherent way to understand it. We have examined the story of Cain and Abel with unflinching honesty. We have exposed the arbitrary favoritism at its core. We have traced how that favoritism led inevitably to violence. We have applied Spinoza's framework to understand what the story reveals about human psychology and about flawed concepts of God. We have explored alternative readings and addressed the objections to our analysis. Now the question becomes, where do we go from here? What do we build after we have torn down the traditional interpretation? What kind of ethics, what kind of theology, what kind of spirituality can we construct on more solid foundations? The first thing we are building is an ethics based on reason and human flourishing, rather than on arbitrary commands from authority. This means we determine what is right and wrong by examining what actually promotes well-being for human beings and what causes harm. We look at the consequences of actions and the principles behind them. We ask whether a rule or practice makes sense, whether it treats people fairly, whether it creates conditions for people to thrive or conditions for people to suffer. We do not accept something as good simply because an authority says it is good. We evaluate it based on whether it actually produces good outcomes. This kind of ethics is more stable and more defensible than one based on divine commands that we are told not to question. If someone asks us why lying is wrong, we can explain that it destroys trust, damages relationships, and creates social environments where cooperation becomes impossible. We do not need to say, because God commanded it. We can give reasons that any thinking person can understand and evaluate. This makes our ethics truly universal because it is based on human nature and human needs rather than on the particular beliefs of a specific religious tradition. The second thing we are building is a concept of God that is worthy of reverence rather than one that mirrors the worst aspects of human authority. Spinoza showed us that we can understand God as the rational structure of reality itself, as the interconnected nature of all existence, as the principles according to which the universe operates. This God does not have favorites, because this God is not a person with preferences and emotions. This God does not act arbitrarily, because this God is the very principle of rational order. This God does not need to be obeyed out of fear, because this God simply is the way things are. And understanding this God means understanding reality more clearly. This conception of God elevates the divine rather than diminishing it. The God of the Cain and Abel story is small, petty, and capricious. The God of Spinoza is infinite, necessary, and the source of all that exists. The God of traditional religion acts like a human tyrant. The God of rational philosophy is the foundation of truth itself. Which concept is truly more worthy of what we might call worship or reverence? Which God would we rather serve? Not the God who plays favorites and punishes those who question, but the God who is perfect rationality and perfect justice, because this God is reality itself, operating according to unchanging principles. The third thing we are building is a relationship with Scripture that is honest and mature rather than childish and credulous. We can value ancient texts for what they reveal about human experience and human attempts to understand the world. We can appreciate their wisdom while acknowledging their errors. We can learn from both their insights and their mistakes. We treat the Bible and other sacred texts the way we treat any important historical documents, with respect, but also with critical thinking. We do not need to pretend they are perfect in order to find value in them. In fact, being honest about their flaws allows us to learn more from them than we could if we had to defend everything they say. This approach does not destroy the spiritual value of Scripture. It enhances it by freeing us to engage with these texts honestly. We can have genuine conversations about what they mean and what they should mean to us. We can wrestle with their difficult passages rather than explaining them away. We can allow ourselves to be challenged by them without being enslaved by them. This is how mature readers engage with important texts in every other field of human knowledge. It is how we should engage with religious texts as well. The fourth thing we are building is intellectual courage and the willingness to think for ourselves. For too long, religious authority has demanded that people accept what they are told without questioning. This has kept humanity trapped in outdated ideas and harmful practices that could not survive honest examination. Spinoza paid a terrible price for his intellectual courage. He was excommunicated, threatened, and died in relative poverty and obscurity. But his ideas survived and flourished because they were based on reason and truth, rather than on power and tradition. We continue his work when we ask difficult questions. We honor his legacy when we refuse to accept injustice simply because it is sanctified by tradition. We follow his example when we use our minds to think clearly about morality, about God, and about how we should live. This intellectual courage is not easy. It requires us to risk being uncomfortable. It requires us to risk being criticized by those who prefer comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. But it is the only path to genuine freedom and genuine understanding. The fifth thing we are building is a community of people who value truth over comfort, who support each other in asking difficult questions, and who refuse to let ancient authorities dictate what we must think. This is what we are creating here in this channel. Every person who watches these videos and genuinely engages with the ideas is part of this community. Every person who supports this work is making it possible for these ideas to reach more people who are ready to think for themselves. This community is essential because thinking freely has always been dangerous. Those who benefit from traditional power structures have always opposed those who question those structures. Throughout history, free thinkers have been persecuted, marginalized, and silenced. They have needed communities of support to continue their work. Spinoza had a small circle of friends and supporters who helped protect him and preserve his writings. We have the advantage of modern technology that allows us to connect across distances and build communities of free thinkers that are harder to silence or suppress. But we still need each other. We still need to support those who are doing the difficult work of challenging sacred narratives and building better alternatives. The ultimate question is not whether God preferred Abel over Cain. The ultimate question is what kind of God we want to believe in and what kind of world we want to build. Do we want a God who acts arbitrarily and expects us to submit without question? Or do we want a God who represents the highest ideals of justice, consistency, and rationality? Do we want a world where authority does not need to justify itself, and where those who complain about unfairness are blamed for their complaints? Or do we want a world where everyone, including the most powerful, is accountable to principles of fairness that we can all understand? Spinoza chose the God of reason over the God of arbitrary power. He chose intellectual freedom over comfortable submission. He chose truth over tradition. And in making these choices, he showed us a path that we can follow today. A path that does not require us to abandon spirituality but asks us to purify it. A path that does not require us to reject morality but asks us to ground it in understanding rather than in fear. A path that does not require us to deny God but asks us to conceive of God in a way that is worthy of genuine reverence. This is the work we do here. This is the journey we are on together. And every video, every analysis, every honest conversation about difficult questions is a step forward on this path, a step toward clearer thinking, a step toward more consistent ethics, a step toward genuine freedom, a step toward a better understanding of what it means to be human in a universe that we can comprehend through reason rather than one we must navigate through blind obedience to incomprehensible commands. The real tragedy of the Cain and Abel story is not just that one brother killed another in a field thousands of years ago. The real tragedy is that for millennia, generation after generation has read this story and concluded that God was right to show arbitrary favoritism and that Cain was completely wrong to feel hurt by it. The real tragedy is that this story has been used to justify countless injustices throughout human history. It has taught people to accept mistreatment as divine will rather than to recognize it for what it truly is, an injustice that must be named, confronted, and corrected. This story has conditioned us to blame victims for their natural responses to unfair treatment, rather than to hold accountable the systems and authorities that created the unfairness in the first place. It has trained us to accept that those in power do not need to explain themselves, that authority is its own justification, that questioning why we are treated differently is itself a form of sin or rebellion. These lessons have served the interests of the powerful for thousands of years, but they have never served the cause of justice or the flourishing of human beings. But it does not have to be this way. We can read this story differently. We can see in it not a justification for divine injustice, but an inadvertent exposure of how injustice operates. We can recognize that the God portrayed in this story, the God who plays favorites without explanation and then blames the disfavored for their hurt feelings, this God is not worthy of our worship. This God is worthy of our critique, our honest examination, and our refusal to accept that such behavior represents the highest good. We can use this story as a starting point for much deeper conversations about justice, about fairness, about the nature of authority, about how we should treat each other, and about what morality actually means. We can learn from what the story reveals about human psychology, even while rejecting what it claims about divine behavior. We can grow beyond the limitations of ancient authors who projected their experiences of arbitrary human authority onto their understanding of God. And in doing so, we honor the true legacy of Baruch Spinoza. Not a legacy of destroying faith for the sake of destruction, but a legacy of purifying faith by removing the human projections that have made God seem cruel, petty, and arbitrary. Not a legacy of rejecting morality, but a legacy of building morality on foundations that can actually support it, foundations of reason and understanding, rather than foundations of fear and blind obedience. Not a legacy of abandoning the divine, but a legacy of conceiving the divine in a way that is truly worthy of reverence. The work we do here in this channel is not easy work. It requires us to question narratives that have been treated as sacred and unquestionable for thousands of years. It requires us to think for ourselves, rather than simply accepting what religious authorities have told us we must believe. It requires us to have the courage to say that the emperor has no clothes, to say that the God of this particular story does not act justly, to say that the traditional interpretation is morally bankrupt and intellectually dishonest. But this work is absolutely essential, because as long as we continue accepting narratives that justify injustice, we will continue perpetuating injustice in our world. As long as we continue imagining God as a being who can act arbitrarily without needing to answer to any moral principles, we will continue justifying human beings who act arbitrarily and claim they do not need to answer to anyone. As long as we continue blaming victims for their natural responses to mistreatment, we will continue allowing those who create the mistreatment to escape responsibility for their actions. Spinoza offered us a way out of this destructive cycle. He showed us how to think about God in a way that does not require us to defend the indefensible. He showed us how to build morality on the solid ground of reason and human understanding. He showed us how to engage with Scripture honestly without being enslaved by it. He modeled the intellectual courage required to challenge sacred narratives when those narratives conflict with genuine justice and genuine truth. And he paid a heavy price for this courage, but his ideas survived because they were built on something stronger than tradition or authority. They were built on reason itself. So the next time you hear the story of Cain and Abel, do not accept it passively. Question it. Ask yourself whether Cain was really the only villain in this story, or whether he was also a victim of divine injustice. Ask yourself whether it is truly morally acceptable for God to show favoritism without explanation. Ask yourself whether we should demand more from our concepts of God than we demand from human beings, or whether we should settle for less. And when you ask these questions, when you follow this line of reasoning wherever it leads, you are walking in the footsteps of Spinoza. You are polishing the lenses of your reason to see reality more clearly. You are freeing yourself from the chains of narratives that were forged in ancient times and that no longer serve human flourishing. You are building a foundation for ethics that is more solid, more just, and more genuinely worthy of being called divine than anything you will find in the traditional interpretation of this ancient story. This is the path of forbidden reason. It is a difficult path. It is a path that requires courage, because challenging sacred narratives has always been dangerous. But it is the only path that leads to genuine intellectual freedom and genuine moral clarity. And it is the path that we walk together as a community of truth seekers, as people who refuse to accept comfortable lies when uncomfortable truths are available. If this analysis has opened your eyes to a new way of reading ancient stories, if it has helped you see the structures of power and control that hide behind seemingly simple narratives, then I ask you to take action. Leave your like on this video. Each like is an act of intellectual resistance against centuries of enforced ignorance. Share this video with others who are also searching for truth rather than comfortable illusions. Comment with your own thoughts, your own questions, your own interpretations. Engage with this community of free thinkers. And if you truly value this work of dismantling control narratives and building a more rational and ethical understanding of our world, then consider subscribing to this channel. Consider becoming a member. Consider supporting this work financially if you are able, because this kind of critical thinking has always been threatening to established power structures. It has always required the support of a community of people who are committed to truth above comfort, to justice above tradition, to reason above superstition. You are part of this community now. You are part of this movement toward intellectual freedom and moral clarity. Together we are continuing the work that Spinoza began more than 300 years ago, the work of liberating humanity from the chains of fear and superstition, the work of building ethics based on reason, understanding, and genuine compassion, rather than on blind obedience to arbitrary authority, the work of freeing our concept of God from the human projections that have turned the divine into a cosmic tyrant. The story of Cain and Abel is ultimately a story about us, about how we respond to injustice, about how we build narratives to justify our prejudices, about how we project our darkest impulses onto the divine in order to give them ultimate authority. But it is also a story about the possibility of reading critically, of thinking independently, of building something better than what we inherited. When read with the eyes of reason, rather than the eyes of blind faith, this story becomes a tool for liberation, rather than a tool for control. Thank you for having the courage to question. Thank you for being part of this community of truth seekers. And I will see you in the next video, where we will continue polishing the lenses of reason to see with ever greater clarity the hidden truths behind the narratives that have shaped us. This is the path we walk together. This is the freedom we claim together. And this is the future we build together.